Hey, are we live? All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Mary Bird. Happy to see you all this morning in person and online. Thank you for joining us for today's Adult Forum. We're in for a treat this morning. Some of our parishioners have been doing research in the St. John's Cemetery, and they're going to share with us how that ties into the history of St. John's, Tallahassee, and of course the state of Florida. So I'm here simply to welcome and introduce you to Betty Ashler and David Proctor, two of our parishioners who have lots of great information to share with us this morning. So thank you for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Bird. It's nice to be here this morning. Can you hear me pretty well? Okay, is that better? We're going to go along as quick as we can. Some of you are brand new to St. John's, and for the next 2 to 3 minutes, I want to show you a very brief recap of how the cemetery looked 6 years ago. Now, when we first began the cemetery project, oh, we don't have the project. Okay, that's all right. You'll get there. Coming up. Here we go. Is that pretty good? Is that good?
I'll just give it a second.
Give it a minute. Okay, we're catching up. Okay, that's good. And when we first began the cemetery research project, y'all, this was back to August of 2016. This is how the original cemetery sign looked, if you can see. Let's go to the next slide. Let's go to the next slide. There you go. It's a little bit delayed there. Okay. So this is how our original cemetery sign looked. And by the end of September 2016, the sign was barely hanging onto its last nail. But 1 month later, October of 2016, the sign was lying face down on the ground. And we thought, oh my word, y'all, are we allowing the legacy of the St. John's Cemetery to fade away? Well, over the last 25, 30 years or more, a growing public awareness has developed concerning the importance of early graveyards and cemeteries. There is certainly no doubt at all that Florida cemeteries are a valuable part of our heritage. Now, looking at the progress that we've made over the last 6 years, we need to go next. Okay. And grass, we found a lot of grass growing along the side of the street. There were broken stones. We even had graffiti on one of the Winthrop stones, misplaced headstones. Trash was not even being collected on the regular basis, and some of the stones were damaged along the walls. Our first attempt at deciding where to start turned up another research project that had been done back in 1991 by a Boy Scout, and some of you all would know the Bull family. Tommy Bull had done an Eagle Scout project in 1991. And had it not been for the research that he had done and gotten a list of the names, when we got to the cemetery in 2016, a lot of the stones had gotten so smooth that you could not really read the names on the stones. So think back in 1991, where computers were not. We did not have the Excel spreadsheet. And so Tommy was using an early version of Word. And thanks again to the early Boy Scout project, he was able to list the names of the people by lot and by alphabetical listing. Now, again, I want to thank the St. John's Foundation. I see Sarah Ball over there and the person in that. In 2017, the St. John's Foundation paid for Paige Asker to place all of the names of the grave listings into an Excel spreadsheet. We were beginning to get started at that point. The Eagle Scout project, plus the 4 years of research, turned into digital files. I'm having to compress a 6-year project into a little bit of time here, but I do want to mention the researchers' names. The research team was myself and Cheryl Dodd. Raise your hand, Cheryl, right over here. Virginia Perkins in the back. Martha Ray's not here today. We had Arthur Kennerly. He started out, but he passed away in the summer of 2017. Now, I don't know how we would have made it. Phil has photographed every stone in that cemetery many times, all different times of the day, plus has been a technical assistant throughout. And this past summer, y'all, we're so grateful. David Proctor realized what we were doing, and you'll hear from David in just a second. He has written historical narratives for the entire cemetery. Now, what happens with all of this work? If you look at the 3 plastic bins, as the researchers did their work, they started turning in their work to me, and we were putting them in the little plastic bins, and I'm very visual, so we had everything color-coded according to the sections of the cemetery. The plastic bins lived in our house. Phil and I are beginning to look a bit archival, and so they lived on my sewing machine for about 3 years. Then we eventually turned them all over to the Florida Special Collections. Now this is a group, Virginia, you and Mary Doug and Mary Paul, some of you had already started having many of the older parish records put at Florida Special Collections. And then we just kind of were able to fortunately follow the good path that had been set there. The people that first came into this area of North Florida, they were truly the who's-it's. We were so lucky as we began to do our research, and Virginia and Cheryl and Martha will all tell you, we go to the archives and you look up their names, and raise your hand. Adam Watson works at the Florida Memory Project there. And there are people. They have beautiful portraits. They had all of this, plus their diaries and their family letters. It was just like a gold mine. So here we have a very special, cemetery that is literally 4 blocks from where we are now, this way, down on Call Street and Martin Luther King down there, within the shadows of FSU. Brian, you work in special collections. I've dealt with Roy.
Here,
but I mean, that's your,
the library,
But we are so grateful. And here we are, this special little cemetery has all of the resources pulling for it, plus the saints that, with St. John's here. Now, for those of you who do not know, well, I just went over that, where the cemetery is located. David Proctor's descriptions, I'm sorry, Bill, I'm not giving you good directions here. Next to, it's not clicking, my goodness. I should have put some caffeine in that switch. Is there another way to click this forward? There we go. Okay, one more time. It's maybe like
I think the thing is, if we're both clicking it, it's gonna.
Oh, okay, Jeff said you're both clicking it. So Peyton, is yours right on it, or maybe we should go for you?
Which, I don't, okay.
Okay, one more, Bill, one more. Okay, the other way. We're gonna get it together, one more time. Okay, there we go. Now, David Proctor has worked on this, and we all did throughout the summer, and he started in 1829 when Florida was a wild and contested place, and he'll end with a glimpse in the modern era. And then he'll give an account of the era, and then after each of his accounts, then I'm gonna give you a couple of examples in the cemetery itself. David, you're on.
Oh, thank you, Betty. All right, good morning, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. It's always so fun to be at St. John's. I really need to retire and just do these kind of things. 18-year-olds, that's an honest. You teach them all day. But anyway, it's so good to be here. I'm so grateful for the turnout. It's funny, I was down there blowing off our pool, and I was wearing Crocs. Crocs are a fashion faux pas. You should never wear them, right? So I shouldn't have. Well, they were old and slippery, and long story short, I managed to be careless and slip on the edge of the pool, fall in, flung myself out, but banged my knee so bad. So I've been hobbling around, and I realized I had a moment in church when I had to do calisthenics. The Episcopal Church, we do calisthenics. And I realized, God's sending me a message here. This is about your lack of attendance. And so then I went up for communion for another dose of it, and I got the message. So I need to attend better. And, but I'm doing it today, and it's so fun to be here. Okay, I just want to say, Betty and Phil and the cemetery committee, I am just blown away by what they have done. And I want to make sure, I'm just, Betty and Phil and the committee, they are the tenured full-time endowed chairs. They are the professors who know this. I am the adjunct that was recruited at the last minute, all right, which is my job at TCC, to recruit adjuncts, among other things. So make sure they have done just tremendous work. Okay. What I've tried to do is put little broader narratives for each era. We kind of chopped the whole story up into eras related to sort of how a history course is taught today. This is the current David Shy book that we're using at TCC for AMH 2010. Y'all can look at it after class, so that it would relate to kind of what students learn today about the eras of history. So this is just such a cool story, because at TCC, we send our students out to the museums to write little papers locally here, and we're finding that is much more engaging for them than going to online to the journal articles or whatever. It's like an adventure, and it's really good. So this project has such a wider value, and I won't go on. I'll stop about that. But when you can take something granular, very local, like St. John's, and show like our whole story and the cemetery, and show the links with the quote big picture topics, things like George Washington and Napoleon, and all that, and because you kind of grow up thinking, well, that's the big famous history, and that couldn't have anything to do with my little town or where I live. Oh no, history is built granularly and ground up. So the project is so fun for that, to be able to show, yes, there are little links with the cemetery. So as far as the St. John's and cemetery story, well, you know, Florida history was Native American for thousands of years. That was my father's arrowheads, and when I was 12 years old, I did that little project. But he found those basically where Hooters and the Northwood Mall are. Students like that when I say, yeah, it's where Hooters is. Yeah. There was a beautiful spring, what is now a drainage pond down there. There's a beautiful sandy spring, and Native Americans had lived there for thousands of years. It was full of arrowheads. So there was a long period before then. Then, of course, the Spanish arrived, and they have a Spanish period. And then the British have a period, then the Spanish come back, and then we get to our time, okay? St. John's is very much tied in with the whole period of the annexation of Florida, the First Seminole War, Second and Third, and Florida becoming a state. I'm going to leave that to Betty, but that cemetery over there is a who's who of Florida history. It really is. And so Florida's annexed. Settlers, white settlers, American settlers want to move here to the rolling red clay hills and old growth longleaf pine, and creeks and springs. It was really a gorgeous place from all the accounts that we have. The Cascades was a beautiful waterfall. There were springs where Northwood Mall is, at Wakulla, Lake Jackson, all that was very pristine. Indians had small villages, but it didn't have near the same footprint, right? What is it that's attracting settlers to North Florida? White American settlers, why do they want to be so desperate to get in here? Those red clay hills grow really, really well. And in the 19th century, if you can grow cotton, you're going to be big time. And that's the whole economy. So St. John's is all wrapped into that settlement of Tallahassee and everything else. Of course, how did we get started? There were settlers coming in after the First Seminole War in Leon County and so on. They wanted that red clay hills. You've heard of Richard Keith Call and the Grove. How many of y'all toured the Grove? Yeah, that's the definite. If you haven't, you need to go there immediately. It is an amazing place. When you look at that Grove, that's what the settlers wanted to be. They wanted to be that giant Greco-Roman mansion, right? And because of the Greek revolt against the Turks in 1820s, and because everybody was taught basically kind of a version of Western Civ in school, everything was Greek. Fraternities, sororities, all of our buildings, coins, you name it. Greek is cool in the 19th century. Our first church was just like a Greek temple, Greek revival, and that was everywhere. All of our coins had that too. So if you're wondering what will be in the first collection plates, of St. John's. And I can assure you those early rectors would have been thrilled to see these, because this was a very depressed, contracted economy. So you have a Greco-Roman lady, Liberty Lady, 1833. That's a $50. You can just start it here. This is from the Gilded Age, a gold $5 piece. This is what J.P. Morgan and stuff carries for pocket change. And if you can get that in the collection plate, you're good. And here's a 50-cent piece from the same time. So just go ahead and send them in order. So it's quite a story. And Betty, I'll let you get back here. But essentially, the Episcopal missionary Ralph Williston is sent here, and the first accounts are funny. It's like a clergyman is rather tolerated and welcomed here. This was a wild frontier town. There was dueling. There were still Native American little groups out in the woods and so on. There was still shooting and fighting associated with that. The First Seminole War didn't just, cut off clean in 1818, all right? So he wants to start missionary work. And then your first territorial governors, briefly 90 days or so, is Andrew Jackson. He had way bigger plans in Florida. But then his deputies take over. Richard Keith Galt, who was one of his commanders in the Indian War. William Pope Duval. Pope Duval's brother was here. And so the new territorial legislature did that with churches back then. Chartered St. John's October 30 in 1829. And that's how we get started. And money is raised by the Reverend Loring Wart, and we get the first Greek revival, Greco-Roman church. That was, I can't tell you how that was the thing everywhere. And so St. John's is off and running. And obviously there's hours and hours more of that, but we need to keep our program moving. I do want to recognize one of my colleagues, Floyd Murphy, sitting there from the state library, the library, human archives and library of Gainesville and everything. I've known Boyd since first grade, and that man knows a lot of Florida history. And if I see him raising his hand, I'm not going to call him. I'll correct me. But chat with Boyd after class, so to speak. He knows his stuff. Okay, Betty, go ahead and take it away.
All righty, and let's go 2 slides. You're going to do it, Pam.
Oh,
2 slides. Goodness.
Well,
And one more. Okay, now, this time, and David was talking about dueling. Well, we have some stories about that. Virginia Perkins is the expert. She had done research on that particular lot. Lot 27, John K. Campbell. At times, attorneys could be forced to duel because of their official duties. Campbell's standing in the community meant that he could not refuse a challenge. In a duel at Mannington on August the 28th, 1833, Campbell was shot and killed. Now, we don't have time to go into the story entirely, but his wife did not know anything really what happened to him. Found out a year later. That was kind of sad. See Virginia after this program. Thomas Eston Randolph and his family. Thomas Eston was a co-founder of St. John's and appointed U.S. Marshal for the Middle District of Florida in 1831. Now, Jane, his wife, and their 3 girls, their daughters, started the first school for girls in Tallahassee. His son, Dr. Arthur M. Randolph, and his wife, Laura, wrote letters back and forth about their son who was dying in the Civil War in Virginia. Again, I would like to point out archives, we have the pictures, we have the diaries, we have the thank you to Florida Archives and all the people that helped in that. We also, one of the most, and Cheryl Dodd will tell you, she did the research for the Murat family. If there's any one grave that anybody wants to see when they come to, it's going to be the Murat grave. Now, to tell you the truth, as we look out at the whole quilt of the entire fabric of the cemetery, they are quite well known, but it's just like any place else. It's really sometimes the regular people that tell the story, that really come and have a lot of things to do connected with the church. But the Prince and Princess, he was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, and Princess Catherine Willis. She was the great-grandniece of George Washington. They settled in Florida in the 1800s, in the early 1800s. They had 2 plantations. It was Lacona and Econchetti, and their plantations were the centers of social activity in Tallahassee. Then there's Henry Bond. Henry bought property in Tallahassee in 1826, and he opened a general store. By the mid-1830s, he began operating a 120-ton schooner out of St. Mark's. Henry was one of the original contributors toward the erection of an Episcopal church in the city of Tallahassee in 1835. Okay, thank you.
So what you've got here is the statehood period, that first territorial period, Richard Keith Call, all the, I love the names on that first vestry, Carey, Bruno, Turbot Benton, you know, Duval's brother, William Pope Duval's brother. It's just like the old streets of Tallahassee on that first vestry. But we move through that period, and St. John survives. And we move into the Florida statehood, okay? So this was a very tumultuous time in American history. Don't worry, I'm not going to do all of that. But you know that the ever-growing issue of slavery is there. You know that there's political arguments, there's all the normal economic and Indian wars and things like that, but you got this growing issue of slavery, because if you can enslave people and clear these longleafs and get the cotton on these red hills, that was your ticket to the top of society at that time. That grove over there is what all the small white farmers kind of dreamed aspirationally that they could be. Now, we know in real economics, how many of us ever really do get to the top like that? It's true today as well. But that was, you know, what's going on. So, but of course, the Christian faith is here, the Episcopal faith, which, you know, we had been the Church of England, and we suffered pretty seriously with the American Revolution. But it was very much the church of the more affluent, the more educated, and so on. So they had to put it all back together and create the Episcopal Church, and they sent the missionaries. And now we have a church up and running. And we built the Greek revival, St. John's. And of course, our Reverend Warwick died in the steamship, the Pulaski sinking. Then you get yellow fever, okay, of which many of the graves tie into that. A lot of financial struggle. There were some terrible economic times, the Panic of 1837. Andrew Jackson's all over our money. He was just going nuts with our bank and everything else. And it had problems. So, but the church grew. The core of it seemed to be plantation owners, but there were also small farmers called yeoman farmers who did not have that. It wasn't as class and nor as rigid and class structured kind of as it had been maybe before the Revolution. It's just anything in America is going to be more broad-based, and St. John's was. So it wasn't just plantation owners by any means. There were a lot of small farmers in there too, and the local business, the elite and so on, and the people who service the plantation economy. Have y'all ever seen the Union Bank building? Yeah, I wish they could do something more with that and let it, because there's a story there. Back in the good old days, you didn't have any bank regulations, so you know when the bank screwed up, well, what happened? You just lost all your money, and you had to run on the bank. Everybody's beating on the door. Love you some FDIC. Okay, you want to get all that government done with? We'll go back then and see how it's like. Okay, you'll be loving you some FDIC too. All right, they didn't have that in the good old days. So, but to show you the church was broad-based, people were trying to live their faith. They were trying to live Christianity as they understood it. They were born into this society. They didn't have the benefits of what we have, but that they could sit there and think critically about it. So yes, there was slavery. There was, you know, the roles of women, how they were treated, what was being done to the Native Americans, but it's very hard to have a big, broad picture that you can get from studying history, if you study history. From the future, that's a big if. But that is the world that is the Florida that St. John's is in. It does grow. It could be, bless you, it could be broad-minded. Apparently, the free black man, George Proctor, who was a noted home builder, and I don't know if there's any connection with my Proctor side or the many other Proctors that are here, but he was a noted home builder, built a knot house and other things. He actually got married here at St. John's with apparently no issues that I can determine. So it probably wasn't as rigid as we might think. I don't know if there were slave galleries or if there were for the enslaved to sit separately. I know First Presbyterian had that. I've not seen research on how that worked, but presumably there was some similar arrangement. But it's always hard, and then of course you got the growing issues of the argument over slavery, sectionalism, westward expansion, how will slavery work in that, and a terrible, conflict is starting to build up in the United States. And here was St. John's in the little corner of Florida in the midst of all those things. So Betty, that will be our territorial statehood period, and we'll turn it back to you.
Okay. Now, in lot 51, we have a really good example there. This is the next slide. Let's see. Oh, we're there. We are here. Okay. This is Robert Berry Augustus Austin. Now, this child died in 1856. This is an absolutely beautiful little grave, a little short one here. And on the front of it, it says, as the sweet flower that scents the moon but withers in the rising day, time lovely was this infant's dawn that swiftly fled its life away. I mean, this is amazing. And the people that stone clean, we're all very careful with that one, because this is an example of a child he probably, we don't know for sure exactly, but given the date, it's one of the markers. In Tallahassee, we kind of have marker dates for the yellow fever. That was in 1840s and 50s. This child probably died of yellow fever, more than likely. Now let's look at lot 55. This is John Wales Baker. This was Thomas Jefferson's grandnephew through his mother. In 1844, he moved to Leon County and was elected a circuit judge for the Eastern District. He had acted as a special representative to the governor of Florida during the Civil War and the federal government afterwards. And then let's move on down to George McGinnis. Again, this is another well-known name in this area. He was an early patriarch of Tallahassee and one of the county's largest landowners. George built the McGinnis Monroe House in 1845. This served as an art gallery for his wife, Louisa. Now, today it is known as the Lemoyne Foundation. And I think they'd be very proud to know that the things are still continuing in the art, He was a prominent local merchant with a hardware store and a variety of real estate interests. Okay.
Thank you, Betty. Okay, St. John's in the Civil War. And yes, that's quite a story here. I wrote, I think my longest one may be about that. But,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, but I won't do that to you. Such a story here. And when you study St. John's and the cemetery, you get a nice granular picture of what did all this really mean. You guys were in high school, coach walked in, did your timeline, for history of the Civil War. Well, what's that? How many of you had coach for history? There you go. Go, coach. Yeah, it's a thing. And so you got your little outline and you're probably bored and you're thinking about the date this weekend or whatever it is. No, you did. And so you see these giant things. Well, how does that really work? And who were these actual people? And here you have a perfect story that, many of us here are probably connected to. Or some of us, or it depends on your background, but it's all interesting, whether you just moved to St. John's yesterday or you've been here since 1829, your family has, whatever. You learn so much from all this. So the plantation economy had expanded, and with that wealth, those folks like the Call family and others, they're going to be in the positions of political power in legislature, the judiciary. It's just how that works. So not surprisingly, as the arguments heated up, and then of course the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln, and I don't need to tell you all that, but Florida was the third state to secede, which may tell you something about how important that was. And just always keep in mind, everything below kind of Gainesville and Ocala was just extremely sparse. There were still, the last Seminole War didn't end until the 1850s, and there was still the group hiding in the Everglades that never did get deported. The rest were deported to Oklahoma via boat. But this was still wild country. And most of South Florida did not really exist except in natural wetlands and so on. So North Florida is the power center, and St. John's is right in the middle of it. The rector at the time, the bishop, of course, Right Reverend Rutledge, was from South Carolina. He had a very aristocratic demeanor. He obviously had grown up in the whole Southern society, and he couldn't really see outside of that. So he believed in secession. He wanted to support this system. And went along with it. He was addressing the secession convention, praying there, and heavily involved with it. Richard Keith Call. Now, Call was a very worldly wise man, the guy at the Grove. Now, he was a slave owner, but he had traveled a little bit. He'd hung out with Andrew Jackson. He's like, hello, this is a big country. You go starting something like this, it may not go the way you think. You want to sit there reading Ivanhoe and thinking you're going to be the hero. The real world don't always work like that, does it? So Richard Keith Call's like, this is how I would put it to my students, but you guys can just kind of chuckle along. You don't really use real formal language when you're dealing with 18-year-olds. You ain't in a graduate seminar. So what I would say is Richard Keith Call, while he was a big slave owner, both at the Grove and out at Orchard Pond, he cautioned the secession delegates. He said, look, you guys, I've been with Andrew Jackson. You guys don't know what you're dealing with here, what you're liable to get started. And he cautioned them to not secede, to think about this, that it could go way worse. Famous last words, it could go way worse than you think. And but the emotion had taken over. And in fact, he was talk about a BMOC, a big man on campus. This guy was BMOC. This is Richard Keith Call. You're very deferential. This guy lives in the Grove. They started turning on him when he said that. Actually, he left in a huff from down the Capitol. He went back to the Grove. They followed him there and were taunting him on the front porch of the Grove because he said, don't secede. And they are now completely emotionally, the legislator, the secession delegates, and so on. They want to secede and have a new country. And to challenge somebody like that shows you how the emotion has taken over. Well, there is this thing called the Civil War. As far as St. John's, it actually caused an increase in membership because refugees from the coastal areas that would have been involved in conflict with the Union, suppressing salt works, trying to stop the cattle trade, and so on, were actually moving inward here to be safe. And so it actually boosted the numbers, and the finances were pretty good. So St. John's was doing okay, but you know how the Civil War ended. I probably don't need to tell you that. And we had a pro-secession rector named Reverend Ellis, okay? So the vote was 63-7 in the secession convention, who were delegates from each county that had been elected. They voted that to leave, but of course the war ended up like it did. Richard Keith Call's last words to him supposedly was, "You have opened the gates of hell and it'll damn you to perdition." He stumped around and went inside the Grove. Well, you lose the Civil War and here you are. War ends, refugees start going back to their homes, St. John's finances start struggling, Reverend Ellis leaves. Poor old Bishop Rutledge is very elderly by this point. He's taken over, he'll die the next year. He just can't deal with it. And he's still trying to pray for Jefferson Davis. And the Union officers that are now attending the church are like, we don't do that anymore. You're gonna need to pray for Andrew Johnson, who, if any president ever needed prayers, it was him. That gotta be the worst president we ever had. Anyway, so that's the new situation, the Civil War. We have survived the Civil War, but it's time for Reconstruction. It's time for Betty to fill us in on the detail.
All right, details from the cemetery. Oh, this is interesting. We might have to have a part 2. 3 descendants of key figures during the Civil War are buried in the St. John Cemetery. Now, these are not the actual folks that David was talking about, but these are relatives. Thomas Waddies in Lot 93, he was the nephew of Bishop Rutledge, who offered stability and leadership during the turmoil of the Civil War. Now, in Lot 164, Eugene Ellis, this was the grandson of Reverend W.J. Willis. He served, who served as St. John's rector. Now, today, the locals know the late Gene Ellis as the founder, y'all know Tallahassee Nursery, so that was his grandfather. In Lot 84, Mary Call's Rivard, she was the youngest daughter of the Florida Territorial Governor Richard Keith Call. And Governor Call had, of course, as David said, warned the delegates of the atrocities that secession could bring. It is through the descendants of the Call and Rivard families that are buried between the Call Cemetery and St. John's cemeteries that we continue to have a rich legacy of the early history of this North Florida region. Now, a soldier, I need to mention a soldier here, is Captain Henry K. Simmons. And Cheryl, you know about that one, that was great. These are pictures, I'm pointing out Virginia and Cheryl, these each, one of the researchers, we had certain graves to do. And he was a commanding officer of the cavalry that was at Natural Bridge Battlefield when he was shot through the head. By preventing the Union troops crossing from the St. Lawrence River, the Confederate forces kept Tallahassee out of the Northern hands. That was part of the story then, okay?
All right, thank you, Betty. We got it rolling now. Okay, so we'll move into St. John's and Reconstruction, which is fascinating. Betty has the instructors edition over there. I've got the student edition. Okay, St. John's and Reconstruction is going to be a big change. First thing is some of the Union soldiers who are occupying and officers that are occupying Tallahassee, some of them are Episcopalians, not surprisingly. So where do we go? St. John. Well, they attend. The first problem is the aging Bishop Rutledge, who was described as being almost sort of like a ghostly figure. He was barely hanging on. And he's trying to make it through, and he prays for Jefferson Davis. So that gets corrected first. And so then he dies not long after. So here is St. John's, a very prominent church. Back then, the Episcopal Church, as I've said, would be a lot of the higher layers of society. Not entirely, it's broad-based, but here it is. Civil War's over, Florida's under Reconstruction. So that's going to mean back then, the Republican Party had started in 1854 with Lincoln and the old Free Soilers, and the Democrats there were Northern Democrats and there were Southern Democrats here who were all kind of governed by the farmers and the plantation class. Republicans and Democrats were very different back then, just kind of, I'll leave it at that. But there's a new Republican administration coming in. It's going to be a new legislature, everything. So, and there's going to be voting rules under Reconstruction about who gets to vote and who doesn't. Anyway, so here is St. John's in the middle of it. Basically, they're just trying to survive, but some of the new Reconstruction officials that are associated with that will join St. John's, including, I'll just say briefly, my great-great-grandfather. If you saw that picture of me by a grave, well, that's on my father's side. There's loads of Confederates in the attic on my mother's side, but she's from Walton County. But the fathers, they brought the Yankees in with Reconstruction. So there's a pair of brothers called the Apthorpe brothers. And of course, Jim Apthorpe, many of his, their descendants are still here. Well, those two were brothers, Jim and William Lee. And, John and William Lee. John was my great-great-grandfather. No, my father was 47 when I was born. I was like a very late addition to the family. So that gave me a World War II dad and ancient ancestors. Most of us don't have a Civil War great-grandfather, but that can happen, at least at my age. So anyway, the Apthorpe brothers joined, and John and his wife Nellie, who was an Episcopal missionary from Massachusetts, the Episcopal Church up there sent her down to teach in the newly established freedmen schools for freed slaves. So here he is, a Union soldier, and his brother was an officer. William Lee, Jim Apthorpe's ancestor, was like a colonel, or lieutenant colonel, I think. But they decided to attend St. John's. This is 1870s. This is how my family got here. Not the normal route. I'm the oppressor Reconstruction side. So they ride down and they take their seats. This is the family story. They sit down in St. John's, which, by the way, is the old Greco-Roman building. The entire pew very studiedly and studiously stood up, all walked away from them and left them alone on the pew. Now, it's pretty obvious why that is. You're a Union soldier and your wife's teaching in the Freedmen's School. You're not our peeps right now. But yet they will be eventually accepted. It seems to go uphill. It seems to get better from the initial welcome. But that's how my family came here. But apparently St. John's was fairly broad-minded in Reconstruction. There was discussion of mission of a school in Midway, of support for freedmen's schools. Eventually, the St. Michael and All Angels, which will be more Gilded Age, will be established. So it wasn't like you might be imagining. I think there was a higher degree of literacy and education that tended to make them think, okay, this is the new world. Maybe we adjust a little bit. You go out in the rural woods in some of those little churches, probably wasn't like that. It was just how society is. But it's a fascinating time, and that's how the Apthorps got here. So Betty, go ahead and move us along.
Well, as David mentioned, the Episcopal Church was certainly, it appeared to be more open to Reconstruction than some of the other mainline churches. Now, I'm going to skip down to, let's look at John Parkhill first. We had Gamble, and he was doing some railroad work there, but in the interest of time, let's look at John Parkhill. The Parkhills were among 4 Virginia families who settled along the Black Creek area in northeast Leon County. And first, they just erected the little log homes when they first arrived. Now, if any of y'all know where Baum Community is out on Highway 90 there, it's from here, it would be east of the Killearn Estates area. With the loss of his brother Samuel and the collapse of the bank, John was constantly trying to save both the Parkhill estates from the mortgages. In the move from Richmond, Virginia to Leon County, John Parkhill brought his enslaved servant with him, James Page. Now, James Page was allowed to leave the plantation in order to hold religious services. A recent book, Father James Page, and it's an enslaved preacher's climb to freedom. That's been written by Dr. Larry Eugene Rivers. This discusses the complex relationship between the master and his enslaved servant. Now, one more thing that I think really in terms of the Episcopal Church looking a little more broad-minded, we have the grave of Reverend Dundas Skull there. This Episcopal priest founded it was called the St. Paul's Institute. It was a school for Negro freedmen in Gadsden and Leon counties. And he and his wife and the wife's sister worked in the school, and they actually had about 126 students. Unfortunately, in the Florida Diocesan Convention, the money was cut out for that. So the school lasted about 3 years. But at least to let you know that this was the part that the Episcopal Church played in the Reconstruction part there, okay?
So we've survived Reconstruction. And then, of course, we'll just kind of call this the Gilded Age, which is often used in the textbooks coined by Mark Twain. So Florida had a little Gilded Age too. We weren't quite Newport, Rhode Island, but hey, we had our little bit of that. In the case of that, you had just a lot of the transition from Reconstruction to what were called the Bourbon Redeemers, which were Southern Democrats who retook over the South, and they pretty much locked it down into a one-party region until really World War II. So you survive all through that. And then you had Reverend Dr. Carter and all those famous people there. But I would say the biggest event, and of course the great tragedy, was there was hard times, as there often were in those wild and crazy days of unregulated Gilded Age capitalism. Failure of the Union Bank again, the Panic of 1873, which really damaged Reconstruction quite a bit, set it back, really weakened President Grant, so on. Well, the vestry was on hard times. And so very ominously, they decided, we can't afford the fire insurance. don't ever do that. They let it lapse, and you probably don't need to be a PhD in history to figure out what immediately happened, which was that the church caught on fire and burnt down. Artifacts were saved. The little baptismal font is from the original, and every time I pass by it, I just look at it. It just does something for me just to see it there. And some of the record books, fortunately, were saved, and that's what they've been digitized. They ran out some of it, but the fire alarm went up, and everybody's running around. But what are your fire services like in 1879? You know, it's pretty. And they built these churches out of longleaf pine, hardwood, and that's like living in a house of fat pine kindling. You know, that's just you can't. The rector here was all caught up in, Reverend Meany was all caught up in what's called the Anglo-Catholic Oxford movement, which was really into ritual, and you know, this sounds familiar. There's still issues in the church today, but he was really into that. Most of the congregation would be called kind of low church, you know, but he kept going on about it, and that was sort of creating some problems. And then, of course, the fire happens, and he's like, I'm out of here. And it was really very tough. And then, of course, the amazing Brooklyn native, Reverend Dr. Carter, will be hired. Now, so Betty, you'll probably want to do some of these graves here. So go ahead and we'll turn it over to Betty.
In the interest of time, and you all have a good bit of the history in your head, I'm just going to mention Arthur Hopkins. And of course, when he married Susan Branch, she was the daughter of Governor Branch. Arthur Hopkins purchased Goodwood Plantation. And it was during the Hopkins ownership of Goodwood that the mansion and plantation became the center of elegant social affairs. And Susan evidently was an excellent hostess and a musician. So we all know the good reputation of Goodwood today. Now, John George Anderson, he graduated from Yale. He was a partner in a successful cotton brokerage in New York. This is in Lot 60. And he had an office between New York and Tallahassee. He and his wife even traveled over to Europe. If you look in all the beautiful windows in our church, that when their son died, they made a contribution of 6 beautiful stained glass windows in our church. And Lot 73, that's Governor William Watson. He actually ended up owning the Buena Vista plantation. He was the first planter in Leon County to abandon the practice of raising cotton. He switched to crops. He was one of the 4 developers of St. Teresa, and it's, of course, we all know about St. Teresa. So that was the example of the 3 there. As far as the folks being buried in the cemetery, one more is Dr. Carter, and David's covered him well. He's buried in Lot 45. He's buried right next to Reverend Skull, who was the one that created the school for the Freedman School. So Carter Chapel is appropriately named for the Reverend Dr. Carter. Okay, David, you're up.
All right, we're almost there.
Getting close.
It's a big, big story, and I thought, how in the world are we going to do this? So if you need to slip out, it's perfectly understandable. We're trying to get it brought home. It's just big. So anyway, what historians call the progressive era, because there's a lot of reform movements in America. We date it between 1900 and 1920. You have a reaction against the Gilded Age, the laissez-faire capitalism. You have the Morrill Act. It created colleges. More people, still very few are going to college, but more people are, and they all get all filled with ideas, you know, when they go out and hear them professors. So there's all kind of reform spirit around things like women voting. Where's my fainting couch? You know, all this sort of thing. And they got worked up about it too. Don't think they didn't. Not to mention World War I, that'll be fun. All in the middle of it. Well, to kind of just show you a little bit here, there's some funny stories involving the Apthorps and my family. So I'm just going to tell a couple of them just to illustrate the changes that were coming in the Gilded Age, ideas of a wider role for women. You had Theodore Roosevelt as the president. You know, he wants to do a little regulation of the big corporations. We're really leaving the Gilded Age. Now, we're out of time, and I can't do all that. But when I say something to my class, like, there are women who are starting to talk about voting. There are women who are starting to talk about the greater role of rights. Well, okay, there it is. Well, how do you bring that to life? What does that mean? Well, John Apthorpe's daughter, Agnes. Now, Agnes, from all I've heard, was a piece of work. Her first thing was that she went to Florida State College. This was before the Buckman Act. It was actually co-ed, believe it or not, before it became FSCW. In 1909, the legislature had a bit that men and women were together, so they separated them out. We got women here in University of Florida, got the Morrill Act and the men, and they got all those majors, and we'll never catch up. But anyway, it's a thing. So Agnes is enrolled out at Florida State College. Those liberal professors just put all kind of notions in her head, from what I understand. She's talking about the women's suffrage. She's driving the family Model T, at which many old people were frowning at her because the man is supposed to be driving the car. That was a thing back then. Women need to be subservient to men to some degree. And it just looked jarring. It's sort of like in 1972 when I saw the first woman police officer. The woman police, that's the way society changes. Well, anyway, Agnes has got notions in her head, so it comes time to be married to my grandfather. And she had been baptized at St. John's, her whole family was. She's ready for a wedding, and she's meeting with the rector. There was a series of rectors. We think it must be Yarnell or David, bless you. I'm not exactly sure because it was in 1912, kind of right between those two. Well, they're having a meeting, planning out the wedding. And back then you didn't make up your own vows or get married on the beach or all. No, you did this, all right? So what you have to say is, I take thee to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poor, in sickness and in health. This is the 1898 prayer book, okay? So you're going to read your vows. Sickness and in health, to love, cherish, and to obey, ladies, you better listen up, till death do us part, according to God's holy ordinance, and thereto I give thee my troth. Great stuff. Well, Agnes puts her foot down and says, I'm not saying obey. Now, where does she get those notions from? She went to school. It's the progressive era. It's not just a chapter in the textbook. It was a time of change. Okay, and she's not the only woman speaking up about that. Well, he wouldn't budge. I don't know what my poor grandfather was thinking. I don't know what they must have said about him at the hunting club. But Agnes had her way, and so they went to Jacksonville, found him a liberal preacher over there, and he cut out the obey, and they got married. And Jacksonville came right back, stayed in the church. And in 1927, it was time to revise the prayer book called Fainting Couch. You know how that is. Well, they revised it. And all of a sudden, wilt thou love him, comfort him, honor, and keep him in sickness and in health, and forsaking all others. Oops, I read the preface there. Let me get you the better part. I just read the preface. I take thee to be my wedded wife. Actually, I need to read the woman's part. Take thee to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. Them editors got hold of it, didn't they? Liberals, you can't trust them. And this became the liberal prayer book, right? Because it did things like that. This is 1927. This is actually my confirmation prayer book. But anyway, fun stuff. But that's how you bring these things to life, is you tell little stories instead of a coach with a timeline. You say something like that, and they're like, wow, that's interesting. So anyway, that's your progressive era. So Betty, take it away. We're almost there.
Well, I'm just going to mention, I know we're really way over.
Yeah, it really ran fast. Sorry about that.
I'm just going to mention the names here. Jessie Copeland McGinnis. Now, y'all know the McGinnis name again. She had helped, she was a helper person. She was a single lady. She was a very shrewd businesswoman. And she actually raised her 5-year-old nephew, Lewis M. Lively. And so the women were stepping up to the plate, helping their family members. I want to mention the name Caroline Mays Brevard. She was a history professor, and she is known for her history of Florida in 1904. It's a well-regarded account of Florida's history. And in 2012, her name was added to the Great Floridians. and of course, Dr. George Gwynn, and he was a great-grandson of Richard Keith Paul. David, come on back up and let's take it into the Roaring Twenties.
All right. And yeah, we can start condensing a little bit here, but yeah, the 20s, boy, talk about change, you've had World War I. And just to let you know, there was a young man serving in the National Guard, and he was deployed on Pershing's punitive expedition into Mexico. Y'all ever heard of Pancho Villa? And maybe some of you have. Well, he was in that. His name was Jeffrey Alfred, okay, very young man. Well, you know, the Mexican punitive expedition was the least of what went on, because you've got the Great War starting, the biggest war that human race has ever had. So Parson Alfred is beginning. Now, this was a time of real change. Scopes monkey trial, the new women's voting thing, all kind of newfangled theories, Albert Einstein, weird art, things like that. And of course, women were different in the 20s. You've heard of flappers. You've seen the dresses suddenly get shorter and all this. Well, the war did that, okay? So for St. John's, it was Parson Alfred, as he was called, but he, after the Mexico thing, he got deployed to Europe and well, by that point, he had become a chaplain. He'd become an Episcopal chaplain in the armed forces. So he was dealing with the wounded, with burials. It was just ghastly, because World War II was a horrific slaughter. And so he was hit by a gas attack. Then he got the flu. Y'all heard of the 1918 flu epidemic. He comes home, and yeah, just slip out if you need to. We're almost there. Comes home, but of course he wants to be an Episcopal minister. And in an amazing decision that really propelled St. John's to much larger status, he was hired as the rector.
Okay. Well, in this particular era, I'm just going to mention the names that you all will recognize right off. The Winthrop family, they lived in Leon County for several generations, and it was Guy Winthrop. They developed Benton Hills. His wife, Pat, was a teacher at FSCW, and she was even honored by the French government for helping to advance the study of French and the appreciation of French culture. Then we have John Steinman Gwynn. You all know George Gwynn, our chancellor. This was his father, and he was a captain in World War II with the 102nd Infantry Division, and he practiced law after that. There's Jack Clarkson. There are so many soldiers in the grave. I mean, it just goes on and on. I'm just going to mention the name Frances Scott Lively. This is a lady. She was the daughter of a physician in Gadsden County. And because of, I guess, with knowing about her father's profession, she actually traveled to Washington, D.C. and learned how to do special surgical dressings. So when she returned to Tallahassee, she was able to help with the Red Cross. And then there's Hamilton S. Tibb Oben. He had served in the Army Artillery there in the Pacific Theater. And later, he and his wife and Kat Oben helped found Holy Comforter Church, which was a mission church to St. John's at that particular time. Okay, David?
Great. Oh, I think we're going to do it.
We're going to make it.
Okay. So let me get myself caught up on here. So Parson Alfred's era, he was for his time, of course, he'd been born in 1891. Well, that's going to leave him with certain attitudes and so on that, we're going through a lot of change, aren't we? You got to always put him in context of his time. But he took over St. John's and got us through the war. And a lot of churches really boomed after the war. The baby boomers all came home. The World War II generation came home and had the baby boomers. My father had served in the U.S. Army Air Force. He gets home and they give him a little folder, a little sheet, and say the GI Bill. Well, he's from Tallahassee. Hey, there's a women's college out there that's about to do what because of the overwhelming number of students. They open it up to men, Tallahassee branch of the University of Florida. Whe's like, what's not to like? Goes out there, signs up, meets my mother, who's an FSCW student, and they're married by Parson Alfred. I got a picture in Carter Chapel. And had 3 kids, me being the last one. Hey, St. John's enters the baby boom. And it grows, it becomes very large. You're doing telecomforters, all kind of activity. It's a growing, vibrant church. You know, in his later years, often, you could say, kind of struggled with some of the more modern ideas, be it civil rights or women or everything else, but it's hard for somebody born in 1891. And before we get all on our high horses, when we're that age, the world's going to change a lot, and we may be looked on by people 100 years from now like, what the hey? So history always progresses like this. But yeah, at his retirement banquet, they had it in the Swanee Room out at FSU. Robert Manning Strozier gave the address. Leroy Collins was there, and he then passed away in 1969, where he too is in the St. John's. Actually, yeah, the cemetery as well. Okay, so that's pretty close. Betty, we'll hand it over to you.
Okay. I'm just gonna mention names at this point. You all heard of the Nicholsons, the Nicholson family, Ralph and Jane Nicholson. He was in journalism, and Jane was a photographer and a gardener, and they lived at Rose Hill Plantation. You all know the Rose Hill is just north of the Place School there. There's Arva Hopkins Sr. He devoted 42 years to Tallahassee as a city manager. And a lady you might not have heard the name of too much, Elizabeth Charlotte Guillen Lovesey. And she was instrumental in the development of nuclear medicine department at Tallahassee Memorial. And then we have Jack Martin Tapers. He and his wife owned the Perry News Herald, and Jack Tapers himself oversaw the Tallahassee Democrat for many years. So I'll leave it at that, and we're into civil rights.
Oh yeah, civil rights. And that's a fascinating period of time. The country's changing. You have a lot of older people who had been born under very strict segregation, both white and black. And they, you know, you're facing a whole new world of change. As we all know, not everybody does change the same way. Some people get very angry and don't want to change. Others are way out 10 miles ahead of the whole crowd or whatever it is. It's just part of human. I just want to humanize history. We get so caught up in our politics and our tribes and things, just everybody stop it. Just put all that down, go read a history book. And you're going to see all the way back to ancient Rome. Everybody chill out and just think, you know, calmly and rationally. Change takes time. But I was baptized by Thomas Barrett, who was more active in civil rights. He wanted to really move St. John's forward. People at that era were not, some were ready, some weren't. History's always like that. So they went through a lot of challenges. They weren't going to allow African Americans to worship here, and there was an argument, and not let them in, do let them in. There was even directives to stop them at the door in the vestry minutes. It's just, people have to changing, and it's always going to be that way. He was basically kind of pushed away because he was seen as being too far on civil rights. And then we hired mine, and some of yours too, of course, Lee Graham, who was an amazing fit for St. John's at the time. He was progressive enough, but not enough to get everybody excited to keep the whole church together. He did it very well, and he solved the civil rights issue, got it open to everybody in a calm way. And he was my rector, and I remember acolyting under Lee Graham. He was a World War II vet. And I remember the change to the 79 prayer book. Oh, fall on the cleaning couch. Here we go. But that was all the era of him. And that sort of catapults us up to the more modern period. And Betty, we'll turn it back to you.
Well, I think I'm just gonna kind of skip my little graves here, but let's move on over to the modern era here. And I'll just mention some of these names. Jack, let's see, we can go a little bit further over. Jack Kane. This would be, y'all know Lucy Carter, you know, Betty Kane and all this, and her family. He served in the Korean War, and he worked with the state of Florida in his job. And then we had Ann Payne Cawthon Booth. This would be Judge Booth. She was the female judge, and she was the first, the judge in the First District Court of Appeal. That was women in law way ahead of their time at the time she went through. Then we had Frances Elizabeth Phillips Monroe Malone. This would be, I think Fraser's gone now, but this is Fraser's mother. And she loved nature. She was, she and her husband had raised their family at Big Bite in Gadsden County. And they spent a lot of the summers at St. Teresa. And she helped start the Tallahassee Junior Museum. And then there's Charles Ivan Monroe. Anytime you fly out of Tallahassee, look up and you'll see the Ivan Monroe Airport Terminal, okay? And then we'll end with Lee Graham there, and he is the one that started the Diggers. Peggy is here as a representative of Diggers. Anybody else that's a Diggers? Phil? Yeah, you, by the way. Oh, we have a new member, Chuck Henson, right? Did I get your name right there?
Yes.
Chuck, thank you so much, a new member there. And he was, instrumental. And then Earl, he's Earl Leon, anyway, Earl, people that keep their own family lots. This is important too. So we appreciated that. This past summer, in June of 2022, Lindsay Hardy called me. This was before she retired, and she said, Betty, do you and Phil think you can take in some of the young people, the youth beat, that's BEAT, being extraordinary around Tallahassee. They needed a place to come and have a service project. I said, oh, we have an entire cemetery. Yeah. They did a wonderful job for cleaning the stones. And I think, David, we probably should close it out. We should serve lunch to these people.
Hello.
Y'all are doing great. We should serve dinner. And I do want to mention Junior Warden, Steve Peters has been an enormous help. It's amazing. It's so good to have really strong vestry people that are so supportive of what you're doing. And one thing on your handout, a lot of this, we have just spent literally the research people, y'all, please, when you see them, thank them. Thousands and thousands of hours. Again, thank you to David, because while we have the specifics, David is able to tie it all together. Look on your sheet there. You see where the digital thing is there. If you have any trouble accessing that site or something, let me know. I'm in the, what is our directory called? The realm. I'm in the realm, and we can get you through that. But these are all these things now. The story we have put on, we've digitized it, and now it's going out into the classrooms, as David said. He's sending his students out to museums and all, and we're also working with the Florida Archives and the different museums. Thank y'all. Oh, and one thing I do want to mention, please, Cheryl died. She designed this. We are constantly having Claire run this off. We're running out of these things. Thank you. Thanks to Cheryl Dodd. She did this as an editor of Florida Bar. Thank you for coming. We appreciate your.
Thank you so much. We didn't run over much, did we?
Thank you, Dave.
Oh, thank y'all for coming. We just really appreciate it. Thank you.